the autumn of 1888, on a ridge above the Dakota grass country, people watched a widow do something that made no sense. They watched her stack hay, not feed it to stock, not sell it, stack it, bale on bale, in a ring around her own porch, like she meant to build a second house out of straw around the one she already had. Some said she'd lost her mind along with her husband. Some said grief did that to a woman, made her build walls where there weren't any threats. But the ridge was about to get a threat, a real one, the kind with a name and a temperature and no mercy in it at all. And by the time it arrived, the question wouldn't be whether Ruth Colby was foolish. The question would be, who was going to survive and who wasn't? Stay to the end, because before this story is over, you'll hear the exact numbers, the two thermometers, side by side, that ended the argument for good. If you want more stories like this one, true to the bones of frontier survival, subscribe now, because you won't want to miss what the Ridge learned that winter. Ruth Colby was 31 years old when the first bale went up against her porch post. She had been a widow for 2 winters. Her husband, Daniel, had died in a cabin, not 4 miles from where she now stood. A cabin with good log walls and bad chinking, walls that looked solid and weren't, walls that let the cold in through 100 hairline seams no eye could find. He had died of the cold slowly, the way men on that ridge sometimes did, coughing through January into a February he didn't survive. Ruth had sat beside him with every blanket she owned and watched the fire eat wood faster than she could feed it, and still the room never warmed past bearable. She had sworn, kneeling on that dirt floor, that she would never again live inside a wall she didn't understand. So when the hay came in that September, a good crop, cheap, because everyone had a good crop, Ruth didn't sell hers. She started building. The nearest neighbors noticed first. Otis Pruitt, who ran the dry goods store at the crossroads, drove past twice in 1 week and saw the same thing both times. A woman and a boy dragging bales up from the field, stacking them shoulder high around 3 sides of a small cabin porch, tying them off with twine to fence posts driven into the frozen ground. He laughed about it at the counter that same afternoon. "Widow Colby's building herself a hen house," he told the men buying flour and nails. "Only there's no hens in it, just her and the boy." The name stuck before the week was out. By the second week of October, half the valley was calling it the Hay Fort, and Ruth Colby had a new name to go with it. They called her Haystack Ruth, and they said it the way you say a joke that's already gotten old, but nobody's bothered to retire. Ruth heard it. She heard all of it, secondhand, through her son Eli, who came home from the crossroads with his ears red from more than the cold. She never answered it. She kept stacking. Silence on that ridge could mean weakness, or it could mean a woman who had already decided the argument wasn't worth having out loud. Ruth had decided a long time before the first bale went up. She'd decided the night Daniel died. One evening in early October, with the wall standing waist high and the light going grey behind the cottonwoods, Eli sat on an unstacked bale and asked the question every child on that ridge was too polite or too afraid to ask out loud. "Will hay really stop winter, Ma?" Ruth kept working while she answered him, tying off a course of twine, because some truths land better sideways then face on. Nothing stops winter, she told him. Winter comes, whether you're ready or not. All you can do is decide what it finds when it gets here. Eli turned that over in his head, the way boys do, chewing on it without quite swallowing it, and went back to hauling bales. Ruth watched him go and thought, not for the first time that autumn, that she was not only building a wall, she was building an answer, one bale at a time, to a question her son hadn't known how to ask about his father. What nobody in the valley knew, because Ruth had never told them, because grief doesn't advertise its sources, was that she'd learned the shape of this idea years earlier, as a girl of 12, standing in a grain elevator in Illinois, beside her grandfather, a granary man named Ezra Voss. Ezra had spent 40 years keeping seed corn from freezing solid in bins that had no fire, no stove, nothing but walls packed with loose straw between an inner board and an outer one. Ruth remembered the smell of that place, dust and dry grass and cold iron. And she remembered her grandfather's hand flat against the inner boards, and the way he'd made her put her own small hand there too. "Feel that?" he'd said. "Corn in there is warmer than the air we're standing in right now. Not because straw is warm. Straw's just straw. It's warm because the air trapped inside it can't move. Cold isn't a thing that comes at you, girl. It's a thing that finds a way in. Moving air is what carries it. Stop the air from moving, and the cold has nowhere left to walk." He'd said one more thing that day, the thing Ruth carried for 20 years, and never once repeated to another living soul, until the week she started stacking bales around her own porch. He'd looked at her with the particular seriousness old men, save for children they think, might actually listen. And he'd said, "A wall doesn't have to be strong. It only has to be still." She had not thought of a grain bin in a decade, but standing over Daniel's grave that second winter, with the wind screaming through chinking that it looked solid enough to fool a buyer, she thought of it again. A wall doesn't have to be strong. It only has to be still. Daniel's cabin had been strong. Strong logs, strong joints, strong enough to stand for 50 years. It had never once been still. The cold had walked right through it, the way her grandfather said it would, following every draft like a path laid out for it. Ruth decided that whatever she built next, it would not be strong first. It would be still first. And she knew exactly what material on God's earth was better at trapping still air than anything a saw could cut, because she'd had her hand pressed against it as a girl in a warm grain bin in the middle of an Illinois winter. She was not the only one on the ridge who understood building. Silas Broom had built more cabins in that valley than any other man alive. And he was not a fool, and he was not cruel. And that was exactly why his warning mattered more than anyone's mockery. Silas came out to Ruth's place in the last week of October, not to laugh, but because he genuinely believed she was about to get herself and her boy killed. And a decent man doesn't stay quiet about that. He walked the half-built wall slowly, running a hand along the twine, frowning the frown of a man doing arithmetic he didn't like the answer to. "Hay holds moisture, Ruth," he said. "Moisture freezes. Freezes, thaws, freezes again. It'll rot your sill logs from the outside before Christmas. And mice." He shook his head. "Mice will nest in that wall by November and chew a hole straight to your floorboards. and a wall built of dry grass sits 4 feet from an open hearth chimney. One spark on a windy night, and you won't have a cold problem anymore. You'll have a fire problem. He wasn't wrong about any of it. Every objection he raised was a real one, the kind a man who had buried 3 cabins to fire and 2 to rot had earned the right to raise. Ruth didn't argue with him. She only said that she meant to leave a gap between the hay and the logs and keep the hearthside clear and check the wall every week with her own hands. Silas looked at her for a long moment, the way a builder looks at a plan he still doesn't trust, and said he hoped to God she was right, because he didn't want to be digging a grave for the boy in the spring. Then he left, and Ruth went back to stacking. The build itself took the better part of 6 weeks, and Ruth did nearly all of it with her own hands and her son's small ones. She started at the base, laying down a course of rough planks raised a hand's width off the earth on flat stones, so no bale would ever sit flush against wet ground and start wicking moisture up into itself from below. That was the first lesson she remembered from her grandfather, though he'd never said it in those words. Keep the material dry from the ground up, or nothing above it matters. Then came the bales themselves, each one 40 pounds of cured prairie hay, baled tight with double twine so they wouldn't sag under their own weight. Ruth and Eli hauled them from the field in a stone boat sled, 1 and 2 at a time, and stacked them in a running bond, each course overlapping the seams of the one below it, the way a mason lays brick, so there was no straight seam running top to bottom anywhere in the wall. For a draft to find, she drove cedar stakes down through the courses every 4 feet, pinning the whole wall to the earth so no prairie wind could work it loose. And between the hay wall and the cabin's own log wall, she left a gap 8 inches, measured with a stick she cut and kept for the purpose, a corridor of dead air that touched nothing on either side. That gap was the part Silas hadn't understood, and the part her grandfather's voice in her memory kept insisting on. The hay wasn't the insulation. The hay was only what held the air still enough to become insulation. By the last week of October, her hands had changed. The skin across both palms had split and healed and split again, calloused thick where the twine bit in, and she had stopped noticing the sting of it, the way you stop noticing any pain that has simply become part of the day's work. She measured everything, 32 inches thick at the base, tapering to 28 at the shoulder height of the wall, 22 feet of running length on the north side alone, 411 bales by Eli's count, because counting them had become the boy's private game, a number he liked saying out loud, the way other children liked saying their letters. By the first week of November, the pattern of the days had settled into something almost like a hymn. Haul in the morning, while the ground was still frozen hard enough to walk the sled across without sinking. Stack through the short gray middle of the day. Check the twine. Check the stakes. Check the gap before the light went. Pull, set, tamp down, pull, set, tamp down. The rhythm of it kept her hands busy and her mind quiet in a way nothing had since Daniel died. And some nights she caught herself almost grateful to the work for that alone, whatever else came of it. By the second week of November, the ring stood 4 feet thick on 3 sides of the porch and cabin wall, chest high to Ruth, taller than Eli by 2 feet. She left the fourth side, the hard side, bare rock and packed clay, exactly as she'd promised Silas, so there was nothing dry and combustible anywhere near an open flame. She topped the whole wall with a slanted cap of split shingles to shed rain and snow off the hay instead of into it. It did not look, from a distance, like anything but a strange grey-gold fortress wrapped around an ordinary cabin. Up close, it looked like exactly what it was. 40 years of an old green man's knowledge, stacked one bale at a time, by a woman who had buried a husband to the cold and did not intend to bury a son. The first failure came on the 11th of November, and it nearly proved Silas right. Ruth woke that morning to a smell she recognized instantly and hated, the sour, mineral smell of wet rot. She went out with a lantern before full daylight and pulled back 3 bales on the north side, the side that got the least sun and the most shade frost, and found the inner face of the hay dark and matted, beaded with moisture, already starting to sour at the touch. Worse, when she pressed her palm to the cabin's own log wall behind it, the wood was cold and faintly slick, condensation, freezing overnight into a skin of frost, then thawing when the sun climbed, soaking straight into the grain of the logs Silas had warned her about. She sat back on her heels in the frozen grass and made herself think instead of panic. She had built the gap. She knew the gap was right. Her grandfather's own bins had a gap, and grain bins didn't rot. So the fault wasn't in the idea. The fault was somewhere in how she'd built it. She spent the better part of that morning pulling bales, and she found it by early afternoon. On the north side, where the ground sloped very slightly, her plank sill sat lower than the rest of the ring, low enough that snowmelt had been pooling against it for 2 weeks, feeding damp straight up into the base course, and that damp had been rising through the whole stack like a wick, condensing against the cold logs behind it, with nowhere to escape, because she'd sealed the top of the gap too tightly with the shingle cap, trapping the moisture instead of venting it. She tore the entire north section down to the sill. She reset the planks a full 6 inches higher, packed gravel underneath for drainage, and this time she left a narrow, screened vent gap at both the top and the bottom of the dead air corridor, so any moisture that did find its way in would have somewhere to go instead of somewhere to stay. Air had to be still to insulate, but still didn't mean sealed. A wall that couldn't breathe at all would drown itself from the inside, same as a wall with no wall at all would freeze from the outside. She rebuilt the whole north run in 4 days, working past dark with Eli holding the lantern, and when she pressed her hand to the log wall behind it, a week later, it was dry and cool and still. She never told Silas about the failure, but she never forgot it either, and from that week on, she checked every foot of that wall. With her bare palm once a week, rain or shine, the way another woman might check a sickbed. By the first week of December, the cabin sat finished inside its grey gold ring, and something on the ridge had already begun to change that had nothing to do with hammers or hay. Rook noticed first. Rook was Ruth's dog, a rangy brown mongrel with one torn ear, who for 2 years had slept every night curled against the cabin door, same spot, same habit, reliable as the sunrise. On the 7th of December, Rook stopped sleeping there Ruth found him instead under the porch floor, dug in against the earth, ears flat, refusing every call to come out. The geese that usually held the slough until Christmas were gone by the 9th, 3 weeks early. A long, ragged line pointed south that old-timers on the ridge read the way other men read a barometer. And on the 11th, the wind, which on that ridge never stopped, not truly, not once in living memory, simply stopped. Ruth stood on her porch in the middle of the afternoon and heard nothing. No grass moving, no branch ticking, nothing. The whole valley seemed to be holding its breath, waiting to find out what it was about to become. Weathervane Dietz, the oldest man on the ridge, and the one everyone still half believed about weather, even after the railroad brought forecasts nobody trusted, rode out to 3 separate homesteads that afternoon, including Ruth's, and said the same 6 words at every stop. "Get your stock in tonight." He didn't explain further. He didn't need to. Men who had lived 40 winters on that ground knew what dead still air in mid-December meant, even if they couldn't have said how they knew it. It came down from the north on the night of the 12th, and within an hour the valley people would remember for the rest of their lives as the bone winter had arrived in full. The temperature that had sat at a raw but survivable 20 degrees at sundown fell to 11 below by midnight and kept falling. By 2 in the morning, it had reached 41 below zero, with wind gusting past 70 miles an hour, driving snow so fine and so hard it scoured paint off barn siding 2 counties over. Nature, on nights like that, doesn't negotiate its verdicts. It simply delivers them to everyone equally and lets the walls argue the rest. Across the valley, cabins that had stood strong and proud for years began one by one to fail. Not dramatically, quietly. A family here woke to frost climbing the inside of their walls an inch an hour. A family there burned through a full week's wood supply by dawn and still couldn't push the room past freezing. Livestock died standing in barns that looked sturdy enough from outside. The storm did not care how strong a wall looked. It only cared whether the wall could keep still air where a man needed it to stay. Inside Ruth's cabin, the hearth held a modest, steady fire. Nothing like the roaring, wood-devouring blaze other families were feeding into the dark. And for most of that first terrible night, the ring around her porch did exactly what a grain bin had done for her grandfather 40 years earlier. It held still. It held its yesterday's warmth against tonight's cold, breathing just enough through its narrow vents to keep from drowning itself, holding too still for the wind to find a way through. But at 3:30 in the morning, with the storm at its worst, Ruth heard something she'd been dreading since the 11th of November, a low, tearing groan from the west side of the wall, where the wind was hitting hardest, and then a heavy, sickening thud. She went out into it. She had no choice. A 6-foot section of the hay wall had torn loose from its cedar stakes, buckling outward under the wind's full weight, opening a gap straight through to bare log wall in exactly the spot most exposed to the gusts. Ruth wrapped a scarf across her face until only her eyes showed, tied a length of rope from her own waist to the porch post so she couldn't be blown off the ridge into the dark, and went out into wind that took her breath the instant she stepped past the door. She could not see 6 feet in front of her. She found the collapsed section by feel alone, hauling loose bales back into place with hands that had gone numb inside 2 pairs of gloves, driving a fresh stake through frozen ground with a maul she could barely feel in her own fist. The wind took the first stake clean out of her hand once, and she had to drop to her knees and search the drifted snow for it with bare fingers before her gloves went back on, because a person who lost a tool out there in that dark might never find another chance to look for it. Cold ain't the thing killing men, her grandfather's voice said somewhere behind her thoughts. Moving air is. And she understood in that moment, more completely than she ever had standing safely inside a warm grain elevator as a girl, exactly what he had meant by it. One wrong step off the porch line, and the wind alone could carry a grown woman into the dark and never give her back. Rook stayed at the door the entire time, barking without stopping, a single fixed point of sound in a world that had otherwise gone white and formless. And it was that barking, more than anything else, that let Ruth find her way back to the door when the work was done. She fell through it, half frozen a little, before 5 in the morning, her lashes crusted with ice, her hands too stiff to work the latch behind her. And Eli pulled the door shut and dropped the bar himself. The wall held for the rest of the night. Neither of them slept again before dawn. They sat by the hearth instead, Ruth's hands wrapped in a towel warmed at the fire, Rook pressed against her side, listening to the wind try the wall again and fail. By the morning of the 14th, the storm had passed on south, leaving the valley buried and silent and changed. And it was that morning that the numbers did what no amount of talking ever could have. Ruth had nailed 2 thermometers up in October, one on the outside of the porch post, exposed to open air, and one just inside the cabin door, mostly, if she was honest, to satisfy her own curiosity about whether any of it was working at all. On the morning of the 14th, Silas Broom rode out to check on her and the boy, half expecting to find what he'd found at 2 other homesteads that week. He found instead a thin curl of smoke rising steady from Ruth's chimney, and Ruth herself standing in the doorway in her nightclothes and a shawl, entirely unharmed. He walked straight to the 2 thermometers without a word and read them both and read them again, because the numbers didn't seem possible on their face. The outside thermometer read 41 below 0. The inside thermometer, nailed to a post not 30 feet away, read 61 above, 102 degrees of difference, held by a wall of stacked grass and still air, while cabins built of good solid logs 2 miles down the ridge had frozen the water in their own kettles. Silas didn't say much of anything at first. He walked the length of the wall, the way he'd walked it in October, running his bare hand along the twine, along the gap, along the fresh cedar stake Ruth had driven at 3:30 that morning. And then he pressed his palm flat against the warm stone hearth just inside the door, the way a man checks a fact he still half doubts, even after he's seen it. He stood there a long moment with his hand on that warm stone. Then he asked, almost against his own will, how much wood she'd burned to hold that heat through a night like the one they'd just survived. Ruth showed him the woodpile by the door, the same stack she'd split back in September, barely touched, not quite half a cord gone in a storm, that had emptied entire ricks at other homesteads down the ridge. Silas did the arithmetic in his head, the way a builder does, and didn't like how easily it came out in her favor. A wall of logs and good chinking, burning 3, 4 times the wood for half the warmth. A wall of stacked grass and still air, burning almost nothing at all. The numbers required no interpretation. They only required a man honest enough to read them. He stood there a long moment with his hand on that warm stone. Then he said the only sentence that mattered, the same 3 words, a formula this old always seems to earn in the end. I was wrong. He didn't dress it up. He didn't need to. The numbers had already made the argument for him, and a man who had spent his whole life reading wood and weather knew better than to argue with 102 degrees. Word of the 2 thermometers moved down the ridge faster than the storm itself had, and it was 2 nights later, close to midnight, that the knock came. It was Otis Pruitt at the door, the same man who'd coined the name Haystack Ruth at his own counter back in October, standing in the dark with his wife and 2 children behind him, all 4 of them wrapped in every blanket they owned and still shaking. Their own cabin had gone cold, past living in the last blast of wind, 2 days after the main storm passed. A second wave nobody had predicted, and they had nowhere else close enough to reach on foot. Otis stood on Ruth's porch, inside the ring of hay he had once laughed at from the seat of his wagon, and he did not know what to say. Ruth didn't make him find the words. She opened the door and stepped back and let the warm air out into the cold to meet them, and said only that there was room by the fire and soup, enough for everyone. She never once mentioned the hen house or the nickname or the counter where he'd made her the joke of the crossroads. She simply took his youngest daughter's coat and hung it by the hearth to dry, and put a bowl in the girl's hands, and let the numbers on that porch post do whatever talking still needed doing. By spring, the whole valley had stopped calling it the hay fort. Silas Broom, who knew a good idea when 102 degrees had proven it to him, was the first to admit he'd been building the wrong kind of wall his whole career, and he said so plainly to anyone who'd listen at the crossroads store. The same counter where the nickname had been born the autumn before. He helped 3 other families raise their own version that following fall, sill and gap and vents and all, driving stakes himself, where once he'd only shaken his head. By the 3rd winter after the bone winter, better than a dozen homesteads on that ridge were wrapped in the same grey-gold ring, and even Otis Pruitt had one going up around his own place before the first snow, built with his own hands this time, and no laughter left in him at all. Nobody remembered, or much cared to remember, who had first called it foolish. What they remembered was the name it earned instead. They started calling it the Colby Wall, and the name held the way a good name does when it's been tested by something the whole valley survived together. The nickname that had once been meant to shame her outlived its own cruelty and became, instead, the only thing anyone on that ridge wanted to say when the first frost came each year, asking their neighbors, half in jest and half in hope, whether their Colby Wall was up yet. Ruth never spoke much about that winter afterward, when Eli, years later, asked her once why she'd never argued back at the crossroads, never once defended herself against the laughter. She told him the same thing her grandfather had told her in a grain elevator in Illinois. The line she'd carried silent through 2 winters and finally spoken out loud for the first time in her own life. A wall doesn't have to be strong, she said. It only has to be still. And neither, she told him, does a person. The strongest protection isn't always the one that looks strongest from the road. Sometimes it's the one that just knows how to hold still and let the cold walk on past, looking for a door that isn't there. Ruth Colby never set out to prove anyone wrong. She only set out to make sure her son never sat beside a fire that couldn't keep him warm the way she once had. Everything else, the name, the numbers, the knock on the door, was just the valley finally catching up to what she'd already decided the night she buried her husband. So here's the question this story leaves you with. And it's not a hard one, but it is an honest one. If you'd driven past that ridge in October of 1888 and seen a widow stacking hay around her own porch while her neighbors shook their heads, which one would you have been? Would you have laughed along at the crossroads with Otis Pruitt? Or would you have been one of the few willing to walk over, put your own hand on that wall, and ask her what she knew that you didn't? Tell me down in the comments. And if this story kept you warm for the last 38 minutes, stay close. There's another one waiting, and winter is always coming for somebody.